All right, so first let me introduce myself. My name is Anisha Donald, and I am a content specialist and instructional designer for Cox Campus at the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. And once again, we are so glad that you have joined us this afternoon. So today we are broadcasting our third webinar in our series, Boosting Reading Fluency, an evidence-based strategy informed by the science of reading. And this presentation is going to be presented by Dr. Laura Reinhardt. So in today's webinar, our speaker will discuss how the science of reading refers to a research-backed comprehensive approach to teaching reading that focuses on how the brain processes written language. Dr. Reinhardt will explain how the science of reading extends beyond phonics, offering strategies that build reading fluency through key skills like phonology, orthography, semantics, syntax, and morphology. So you all will be able to learn a practical instructional strategy grounded in the science of reading that supports students in strengthening these skills to boost fluency. And additionally, this session will also provide resources for both teachers and parents to help foster stronger reading development in students. And so I just also want to remind everyone that if you have questions for Dr. Reinhardt, please feel free to share them in the chat. It really depends on our time if we're able to get to them during our session today. But if not, we will make sure that we get answers to you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Laura Reinhardt is an assistant researcher at the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at the University of California, Los Angeles. She received her master's and PhD from UCLA's Department of Education. Her current research focuses on dyslexia, early literacy assessment, and literacy development. She is also interested in developing and testing interventions for students with ADHD and or dyslexia. Dr. Reinhardt's research articles have been published in peer-reviewed publications, including the Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders and Learning Disabilities Research and Practice. She's also a native Georgian. We're so excited about that. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Reinhardt.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here to give a talk for you. As they mentioned, I'm from Georgia, I'm from Atlanta, and I currently live in California, but it's always great to come back and visit, even if it's just virtual. So today I'll be giving a talk on the POSSuM strategy, an instructional strategy based on the science of reading. And I'm at the Center, as they mentioned, for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA. And here, like at the Rollins Center, we believe that literacy is a basic human right across all learners, all ages, and all backgrounds. And that's what my work focuses on, and that's what informs the work that we'll talk about today. Okay, so today we will cover science of reading and a practical strategy. More specifically, by the end of the talk, I want you to know kind of what the science of reading is and what are some of its limitations. So what is not the science of reading, or and then also the strategy for improving reading fluency in your classroom, the POSSuM strategy. And then I'll end with resources for students' families and resources for teachers. So let's begin with, just an overview of the science of reading. I know that Georgia has been doing a lot of work on the science of reading and how, and I know a lot of teachers are well versed in the science of reading, but just as a little bit of background, the why for the science of reading. So this article here was from last week in the New York Times. So the NAEP scores, which are the scores of how American students are doing in reading have continued to go down, unfortunately. They haven't recovered after COVID. And we see here that if you look at a snapshot of the nation's fourth graders, only 31% are reading at or above proficient. So that's why there's such a big push on science of reading, is that we know that this is the solution that will help more readers read proficiently. Okay, now let's go. Now we have why, but let's go focus on what. So, what is the science of reading? So, I like this definition here. This is a phrase representing accumulated knowledge about reading, reading development, and best practices for reading instruction obtained by the use of the scientific method. So this is usually what people mean when they talk about the science of reading. And I want to talk a little bit about what they mean about the scientific method. So this is something that you might have learned, in elementary school, where you have a question, you research the topic area, you create a hypothesis, test it with an experiment, analyze data, and report conclusions. So this is what's been done in the way that we teach reading, and this is where the information that we call the science of reading is from. But what's really interesting now is we have a lot of studies that are RCTs. So that comes from medicine, randomized controlled trials, where we look at how effective reading strategies are. So you can see the picture with the little people. So instead of patients, they're students. So you take a bunch of students, either in one school or multiple schools, and you randomly assign them. So you essentially like flip a coin, and so half of them go into the treatment group and half of them go into the control group. In this example, the treatment group would get a new and novel reading intervention, and the control group would get what we call BAU, or business as usual. So they would probably get some sort of training on reading, but it wouldn't be this new program. And then they follow up and compare the different outcomes based on the treatment versus control group. And if the treatment group is doing better, well, then this new and novel reading approach is what the evidence supports. And so this is kind of what the studies that create the science of reading are made up of, a lot of these RCTs. And we've learned a lot from RCTs, and I really like these 10 maxims. These are all based on what we know from the science of reading, from decades of research. So the first one, almost all children learn to speak naturally, but reading and writing must be taught. So you've probably heard this through Cox Campus, that reading is not necessarily natural. It must be taught. Children will develop language naturally, but they won't learn how to read, or most of them will not learn how to read without direct instruction. The Cox Campus has gone over the importance of oral language and decoding, phonemic awareness. And today we'll talk a little bit about reading fluency, how that it requires comprehension and it supports reading comprehension, and a little bit about vocabulary, which is necessary for comprehension. Here are the other 5 maxims that we've learned from the science of reading. And I will point out the second one, the systematic instruction is really needed for students, and this kind of indirect or 3-cueing instruction where students need to guess the word based on the letters that are presented, that is not supported by the science of reading. Next, you'll see that these maxims apply to English learners or emergent bilinguals, and a lot of different groups of students. And I want to say a little bit more about students who are designated English learners. I don't know if any of you have designated English learners in your class, but it's important to know that these science of reading informed strategies work for English learners. You know, the three queuing system does not work for English learners, so these strategies are relevant. I think there's also some science reading also taught us that bilingualism is good for the brain for all sorts of students, and even dyslexic students really benefit from learning more than one language. So there's really interesting and exciting research on that. Okay, so we have these maxims around the science of reading, and however, there's still a lot of debate and some controversy. And I think that it's important to, point out that, why there may be some controversy. One, the question is what constitutes scientific evidence? So with my example with the RCT, the question is, let's say you did it in one like a Title I school. Well, the question is, would that same research have the same implications for if it wasn't a Title I school? Or what if you only looked at boys or only looked at girls? Would it generalize? So I think that's one question that people have. The second question is how much value should we place on scientific evidence as opposed to other forms of knowledge? So theoretically and practically, people have seen benefits to using like multi-sensory approaches, but there isn't enough evidence from RCTs and other studies to support that they're better than other approaches. But does that mean we shouldn't use them? That's a question that is unanswered. The second or the third question is, what about the science of teaching reading? So we know a lot about, the science of reading, but the best ways for teachers to teach it is still a little bit of an unanswered question. Number four, I think that some people have incorrectly interpreted the science of reading as phonics only. But as you'll see today, it's not just phonics, it's morphology, it's comprehension, it's fluency. The science of reading really is about lots of different aspects of reading. And then number five, people really have very strong opinions about what has worked for them, and that's relevant and important. If some teachers feel like the three queuing system has worked, I think they're a little reluctant to give it up, and that's a problem. And I think all these issues are explained and described really well in this podcast called Sold a Story. So if you haven't listened to it, or if you have some time while you're driving, I highly recommend the podcast of going over the history and the why and the limitations of the science of reading. So a little bit about what we don't know yet from the science of reading is we still don't know what reading program is best. So, RCTs are really hard to do in schools. That as a researcher, that is something that I try to do. And I will tell you, it's really, really tough. For one thing, teachers leave, they go on leave, they leave the classroom for one reason or another. Students, they're absent a lot, or they may change schools or you may get a new student. It's really, really hard to do RCTs in schools. And schools don't like it when you just come and, put one class. They don't want you to move students around like that. Schools aren't really made to do randomized controlled trials the way they're done in medicine. So we don't have a lot of those studies. So we don't know exactly which reading program is best. And then what works and for whom. So that's the second question, for who. So even if you do have an RCT, whether it's a Title I school, or the social demographics of the children and the students really matter. And so we haven't had enough studies to know if it will have different outcomes for different groups of students. And then one thing we don't know yet, but something that I'm working on is how early can we identify a student who will be a struggling reader? And can we prevent these students from struggling to read? There's some really great work on birth to 5. We think that maybe we can identify students even before they come to school. But that again, is a little controversial and something that we're still working on as reading researchers. But one thing I really like to think about is, all students, they come with, this is from Katz and Petcher, with risk and resilience factors. So they might have risk factors like phonological deficits and language impairments. But if they also have these resilience factors, including excellent instruction and growth mindset, that could maybe tip the scale and we won't see the same reading struggle in those students. So really thinking about it in a more nuanced way is probably the best way to think about some of these questions right now. Okay, and then I want to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of reading, which really informs the strategy that we'll talk about today. So, some of the strongest, and I think, in my personal opinion, most interesting evidence comes from a group of neuroscientists. And some of these education researchers, like you'll see here, they use neuroimaging and neuroscience to understand what goes on in the brain when children learn to read. And then these 3 researchers here are some of the most prolific in this area. From left to right, that's Joanna Christodoulou, Stanislas Dewan, and Nadine Gabb. You might have heard of some of them, and a lot of them do work within the IMBIS, or International Mind, Brain, and Education Society. So, and IMBIS also tries to do practical things for students and teachers. So if you're interested, I would look up this website and see if they have anything that may be of interest to you. So I'll start with some of Stanislas Dewan's work. He's a French researcher, and he really focused on what he calls the visual word form area. So he's done a lot of really interesting research in neuroscience to look at the changes in the brain when children learn how to read. So you can see at the first picture, by the end of preschool, before children learn to read, they don't have this visual word form area. So by the end of the first year, which is really kindergarten, they're doing some effortful reading, and we see lots of activation throughout the brain, and this visual word form area is just beginning to form. And by the end of the second year, or first grade, when there's automatized reading, you can clearly see, or what he's found, this visual word form area, which is really exciting, and it forms relatively quickly in a couple of years. And he also explain some of his work with what is often called the reading circuit. So you can see here, that's the visual word form area, the red circle. So reading starts in the red part where the reader sees the letter. Then the information is spread across the left hemisphere. And then the green and orange areas are what are triggered next. And those are related to language comprehension. And this is kind of what happens that almost instantaneously when you see a word. So start at the bottom left where you see the word carrot. So you get the written input, the visual, the orthographic units, the letters that it's created, and then it goes into the semantic at the very top. You might get an image in your mind of a carrot. And then we go down to the phonological lexicon, the sounds of the different letters, the pronunciation, and then the ability to say the word carrot. And then also talk a little bit about Nadine Gabb's research. She's done some really interesting research looking at the different parts of the brain that are used for fluency. And you can see here the orange areas are the parts that's used. And the middle band, you can see this is for children with reading a disability or dyslexia, that she's found that they're really using a less efficient part of their brain when it comes to reading fluently. And similarly, Joanna Christodoulou studies fluency in children with dyslexia. And she also found that there are differences in the way the reading circuit works for students with dyslexia. The top panel is the typical reader group. The dyslexic group is the middle panel. And then the differences in the brains are in the third panel. So all these researchers together have really given us like a good idea of, what's happening in the brain when we learn to read and what's happening in the brain for children who may struggle to read. So what do you do with all this information I've provided about neuroscience and the science of reading? You might think it's not very relevant to the work that you're doing, but I want to try to convince you otherwise. So thinking about the science of reading and how to build fluency in your classroom. Okay, so you may be familiar with Scarborough's reading rope. So this top strand's related to language comprehension. The bottom strand is related to word recognition. And then when combined with automaticity, these skills make up fluent reading. So you may have seen this, but I want to introduce you to what I think is a little bit of a better model. It looks a little bit confusing and overwhelming here, but this is a newer theoretical framework. It's called the direct and indirect effects model of reading by Dr. Kim at UC Irvine. And I think it's interesting because it describes the nature of relations among the component skills of reading. So this model hypothesized that many of the same skills as in the reading rope contribute to reading, like comprehension, word reading, vocabulary, and background knowledge. But I think this model is better, but it also adds the components that we know are critically important. Social emotions towards reading, higher order cognitions and regulations like perspective taking, monitoring, and also executive functioning skills like working memory, intentional control, and shifting. And an important aspect of this model is it shows relationships among these different skills. And here, I think, is a better conceptualization of the direct and indirect effects model of reading. Again, you see the concepts from the reading rope, but you also see how the higher order cognition and regulation and executive functioning skills are related to reading. And here you see that reading fluency is up here at the top. So I really like this model, and I encourage you to think about it when you're teaching reading, because I think it's more comprehensive and perhaps more useful than the reading rope. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about fluency. So you may have heard fluency described as these three skills. So it's a combination of reading speed, accuracy, and prosody. But I want to take what we know about neuroscience to think about fluency. So while the typical definition describes the output of a fluent reading system, it doesn't really acknowledge the role played by the multiple lower order sub-skills fluently reading requires. And those sub-skills are things like orthographic, phonologic, and semantic processing. So we need to focus on those skills when we think about building fluency. So a better description of reading fluency might be this. Reading fluency's multi-component and interwoven nature is far more complex than the familiar formula of accuracy, rate, and prosody might imply. Students require varying degrees of direct instruction to develop automaticity with and between each underlying skill to become fluent. So before I share the strategy, I want to take a moment to say a little bit about repeated reading. So there has been some research showing that repeated reading does help on the passages where students have done repeated readings, but there's really not data to show that this generalizes to new unfamiliar texts. But the strategy that I'll show you today is more generalizable. So I'm not saying, get rid of repeated reading, but I think it's also good to use it with the strategy that I present today. Okay, so instead of repeated reading, a multi-component approach develops, integrates, and automatizes knowledge across multiple aspects of word knowledge, including phonology, orthography, semantics, syntax, and morphology. And we'll go over each of these. If you're not familiar with them, don't worry, I will give you lots of examples. I want to show that this strategy is really based on the science of reading. So the researchers here were able to do an RCT, or a randomized controlled trial, where they randomly selected or randomly assigned children to different groups. And while all groups made progress, which is expected, after 70 hours of intervention, the students who made the most progress, they were the students that were in this group with the the short dashed line, the FAB plus RAVO, and the RAVO strategy is what I'm presenting on today. So there's, scientific evidence that this strategy is helpful. Okay, so it might be hard to remember all these components, but here's an acronym. So for POSSuM, um, the the acronym is phonology, orthography, semantics, syntax, and morphology. And here's a cute little possum. It is a bit challenging to find cute possums. I know they are our friends, but some of the pictures look a little bit scary. But here's the best attempt at a cute little possum. And going back to, what we've learned from the science of reading, one thing is that these emergent literacy skills, the ones that I'm going to go over, the POSSuM skills, really are the foundation that is necessary in order to get to text reading fluency. And then if you go back to Stanislaus Dewan's, what happens in the brain when you see a word, it really is going through the orthographic, the semantics, the phonological, and, in connected text, the syntax. So all these components are really necessary. And we know that based on the science of reading and the neuroscience of reading. Okay, so let's go over each of these in detail. So the first, or the P in POSSuM, stands for phonology. So these are the rules that govern the sound structure of language. So not the letters. So peeling off the letters, think about the sounds. Word like hat is easy. It has 3 sounds, but then a word like knock also has 3 sounds, even though it has 5 letters. So really helping students, play around with the sounds within words. Phonology is really helpful for building the fluent reading. Next is orthography. So these are the rules that govern the letter patterns and the way they're used to spell words. And English is really tricky. It's unfortunate for a lot of our struggling students because, especially the vowel sounds, there are multiple ways that can be spelled, but just more practice with orthography, knowing that, for instance, for sheep, the long E sound is the double E there. That can really help students, with spelling, with orthography, and that's really helpful for building fluency. Next, semantics. So semantics is the size of a vocabulary and the breadth and the depth. And knowing that many, or if not most, words are polysomous, meaning they have more than one meaning. So if you think about spring, it could be the season after winter, could mean a verb to move forward rapidly, a flowing brook, a synonym for originate. So the more definitions a student knows about a word, the more fluently they'll be able to read. Next, syntax. So syntax is really just parts of speech, and the teaching parts of speech can help students with fluency. So for instance, with spring, knowing that spring can be a noun or a verb can be helpful, and it will help students read fluently. Next, morphology. So this is the system for organizing and understanding all the smallest units of meaning, which is morphemes. We usually think of, the most common smallest morpheme is the letter S. So adding an S typically makes it plural. And understanding morphology can be really helpful, particularly when it comes to a multisyllabic unknown word. And students, when they understand which are prefixes and suffixes, they can peel it off and more easily decode and comprehend a word. So, taken together, improving reading fluency is not just a matter of practicing until reading becomes automatic or about guided rereading, but rather it's about increasing the rapid access and integration of students' breadth and depth of word knowledge and connecting linguistic knowledge with their automatic decoding processes. Such integration requires the systematic and explicit teaching and practice of all aspects of word knowledge and their connections. In other words, POSSuM strengthens the reading circuit. And it's important to note that this is really related to neuroscience and the science of reading. So this is related to the reading circuit, and the POSSuM strategies really help activate that whole circuit. So let me give you some examples of what this might look like in a classroom. So for instance, if the word was bark, so you could ask students to identify the number of sounds in bark. It's actually 3 with that bossy R vowel there. You can play around with orthography by having students, think of other words that start with the onset, the B, or other words that end with the rhyme, the arc. When it comes to semantics, you can have students think about as many definitions, a different definition. And then for syntax, use it as a noun and a verb. And then play around with adding suffixes and prefixes to better understand how the word can be used in a variety of contexts. Here's another example trick. So you can think about the number of sounds or the phonology, and compare it to the number of letters, because the CK is just one sound. Have students play around with identifying the onset and the rhyme pattern, thinking of different words that start with the same rhyme pattern, to list all the definitions, and then different ways that the word can be changed by adding prefixes and suffixes, and different ways to use in a sentence. Okay, so I'd like you to take 2 minutes and come up with an example for the word stew. So I want you to write down what are the POSSuM skills. Remember, there's a P, there's an O, there's 2 S's, and there's an M. And then try to use, come up with examples for the word stew. and I will give you 2 minutes to do this. And this is also a science-based strategy. There's lots of evidence showing that practicing helps build memory for different skills. So go ahead and take a minute to practice with the word stew. Okay, well, hopefully, let me go ahead and share the answers here. So hopefully you remember that the first P is phonology, and so you would have students identify the number of sounds in the word. So for the example, stew, that's actually 3 sounds, even though there's 4 letters. Um, Second, orthography. So there'd be an onset and a rhyme. The st is the onset, and the ew is the rhymes. You can have students think of other words that start with the onset, or other words that end with the rhyme. And then semantics. So try to think of 3 or more different meanings. Have them here. So it could be a dish of meat and vegetables, like a lamb stew there. It could be a state of great anxiety, or it could also mean just to stew some vegetables. And then for syntax, uh, it could be used as a noun or a verb related to the different meanings. And then you could also use morphology to change the word to stewed, stews, or stewing. So hopefully that gave you some time to practice. I did have one more example here, but I won't make you do it on your own. You can think about it for a brief moment. But here's an example, crane. So if you were thinking about the word crane with morphology, there's 4 sounds there, even though 5 letters. The onset, which is the CR, and then the rhyme, the ANE. The semantics, 3 or more. There are different meanings. So it could be the bird, it could be to crane your neck, it could be the bottom picture there. And there could be different ways to use it as a sentence and a noun and verb. And you could also use morphology to add the ed, add the s, add the ing. Okay, so in summary, so there's just a lot of evidence showing that For fluency to develop, really students need to know the retrieval or be able to retrieve letter patterns. So that's orthographic knowledge, and the connections to their corresponding sounds. That's phonological knowledge. But they also need to access the meanings of words, the semantic knowledge, roots and affixes, the morphological knowledge, and the varied functions of words, play and sentence structure, so syntactic knowledge. So findings from neuroscience illustrate that all five aspects of word knowledge or POSSUM skills contribute to the neurological reading circuit, or networks of neurons and brain cells that are activated when the brain deciphers text. So in other words, to simplify it a lot, so this multi-component approach for fluency instruction, the POSSUM, is a strategic way to build students' automaticity. So hopefully you can use this strategy in your classroom. Okay, and although I hope you'll use the POSSUM strategy in your classroom. Students spend a lot of time at home, and I also want to provide some resources to help parents and family members support reading at home, because that's another really fantastic way to build fluency. So we know from a lot of research, and again from science of reading or randomized controlled trials, that when parents do things like shared book reading at home, or even when they teach about reading and writing, that this has a positive impact on students' reading skills. This is just one paper from child development showing that parent involvement really improves students' reading skills. But a lot of parents don't know where to start, or they don't have the materials. They're not provided to them. So I want to provide some examples of some free materials, and they also need a lot of encouragement. So I want to encourage you to encourage your students' families to read at home. So one website that I think is really helpful is Reach Out and Read. So if you go to Reach Out and Read and click on Resources for Children, they have these seasonal booklets. They have different ways to learn at home, and even have resources in Spanish. So just a lot of great resources that are free, that you can learn at home. And Reach Out and Read is one of those organizations that gives out books in the well child visits, at the pediatrician's office. When COVID began, I began working on a resource library, and here's the website here. I'm sorry I don't have a QR code, but I'll circle back to it at the end. So this website has a compilation of links to free and high quality content for children and adolescents with different levels of reading proficiency. And all this content has been vetted by research scientists and is based on the science of reading. And this resource is designed to help parents and teachers easily navigate through a lot of just the overwhelming amount of information available online. So when you go to the website, you'll see different areas. So there's early childhood, early readers, developing readers, and more advanced readers. We didn't want to put ages or grades here just because, students, it just depends. Sometimes early readers are, in later grades, but really early childhood is 0 to 5. Early readers are the first couple years, developing readers, 3rd to 5th grade, and then more advanced readers beyond 5th grade. And if you click on something like early readers and then letters and word parts, you'll see a bunch of activities on the left side, and then the description. And there you'll see, which activities are more valuable for parents and which ones are better for teachers, and then where they came from. And again, there's also resources in Spanish here. If you go to developing readers learning to read long words and longer texts, there's some really good resources here for reading fluency. So if you look on the left side, you'll see some fluency resources there for parents. So how do I engage in partner reading with my child? So that could be a good one to go use with parents. There's also a resource, again, for parents. So, what do we mean by developing readers? What does the science say? And this is really broken down in parent friendly language. And, what can they do to help build reading and reading fluency at home? There's also what I think is a nice list of books that children can read and books that adults can read to children. If you work with older students, I want to encourage you to check out this website by my colleague Carol Iago. She's created just a wonderful book list for older students, just to help build reading fluency and just to get students reading more. I know there has been a lot of controversy around, using technology when it comes to, students staying off of screens. But we know that students will be on screens and parents will be on screens as well. And so I want to introduce this app. It's called Grapho Game, and there's some research behind it showing that when the game was coupled with adult engagement, I think that's key. So when the child and parent did it together, they had it helped children's reading. So it's a lot about phonics and phonological awareness. It was a app developed, or it is an app that was developed in Europe. So you'll see they have British English and American English, and a number of other languages that it's available in. And I think it's also useful to tell parents about opportunities to build literacy in the grocery store or while driving. If you go to the website Reading Rockets, there's a lot of great resources here for what you can do in the grocery store, how to play around with the words there, and the different sounds that make up the words. Also, while driving is an excellent opportunity to talk to children and get them developing their literacy skills. Okay, and then I also want to share some resources for teachers, particularly when it comes to building fluency. So I hope you're all aware of IS Wexworth's Clearinghouse, and I really hope this does not go away anytime soon. It's part of the Department of Education. So if you Google IES and WWC, you'll get to this website that shows all the research that really has been done in a lot of different areas. Like literacy, there are these practice guides, and all this information is free. The practice guides give you, information on, what the research says about the best ways to help struggling readers. Also, if you want to look at specific interventions, if you go to the interventions and then you click on something like literacy, it'll give you for a lot of the different literacy interventions. And they do have pretty rigorous standards. So they only look at interventions that had RCTs. And as I mentioned, RCTs are hard to come by. So you won't see a lot of interventions that have tier 1 or strong evidence. However, that doesn't mean that they're not helpful. It just means that, they don't have the evidence yet. But this is a great place to start if you're wondering if an intervention that you're considering has evidence behind it. Want to say that the Haskins Global Literacy Hub, even though I focused on it for parents, I also think it has wonderful resources for teachers. I would encourage you to go through the website to see if there's anything you can use in your classroom. And again, all these resources are free. I also encourage you to look at the Reading League. So if you go to their website under professional development or resources, they have wonderful resources that are really, they're all free. They're all, I think, very accessible about the science of reading. And, they break down a lot of the science really wonderfully. And there is some information there about building reading fluency as well. IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, also has some wonderful materials for teachers. If you have students with dyslexia or you have students who you think may have dyslexia in your classroom, they really have some wonderful resources. And again, they are free. And of course, Cox Campus has excellent resources. I helped develop the one on reading fluency. So I want to encourage you to check out Cox Campus and all their different modules. At UCLA, I am part of the UC CSU Collaborative for Neuroscience, Diversity, and Learning. And what we are is we're a collaborative of researchers and educators from both the University of California and the California State University system. And we work together to create modules for teachers. So you can see the list of modules that we have here. So there's Introduction to Dyslexia, Dyslexia in the Brain, Screening and Assessment for Dyslexia, Early Childhood and Dyslexia, and Multilingual English Learners and Dyslexia. And these modules, they are, I think they're really wonderful. I'm a little biased because I worked on them, but they're also freely accessible. Right now, they are on our website, and you can take a picture of this QR code here and you can get to our website. But I'm very excited to announce that these modules will also be on Cox Campus very soon. And they just are a wonderful resource for everything literacy and literacy development, and include lots of strategies for assessing students for a lot of different literacy skills, including fluency, and then how to build those skills within your classroom. Okay, and the last resource I want to share is myself. I'm happy to answer questions and to be a resource for you when it comes to building literacy and building and boosting fluency in your classroom. Thank you so much, and I am happy to take some questions if we have a little bit of time.
Well, it looks like we don't. Dr. Reinhardt, you did such a great job talking and explaining that everyone has it. Again, if you do have questions, you can contact us, and we're going to have someone put a link in where you can contact us. And then also be on the lookout. We will be sending out a link to the recording of this presentation.
Dr. Reinhardt, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We are so appreciative of you. And before we go, I do want to make sure that we do have a poll that we want to go ahead and put up there for you guys to take very quickly. It's just a quick 3-question poll to give us feedback so that we know how to better ourselves and do better things for you all. Thank you guys so much for joining us this afternoon. You could have been spending your time anywhere else, but you were here, so we thank you so much. We do have another webinar coming up in April, so we hope that you will join us for that one. We look forward to seeing you there. And once you finish that feedback survey, you are welcome to go. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.